The views, information, and opinions expressed during the following program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent the views of Access Communications, its representatives, or its employees.
Welcome to Planting Seeds, Philanthropy in Saskatchewan, a show where we aim to connect you to the community impact that's being powered by donors and charities across the prairies. I'm your host, Victor, with the South Sask Community Foundation, and I hope you enjoy the show. I'd like to welcome my guest to the show, Lori Campbell, today. Lori is the University of Regina's Associate Vice President of Indigenous Engagement. And we're actually here to talk a bit about an event, well, a series of events that the U of R put on and Lori really helped lead regarding, well, the title of it was Quayasgastasoin, Setting Things Right. And it was around really setting up, I guess, a discussion about how people can play a role in reconciliation when we talk about truth and reconciliation. This grant, or the grant for it that helped fund it, was actually through South Sask Community Foundation's Truth and Reconciliation Fund. I believe this was the first project we funded. If not, it was the first or the second. So it was really neat to see this one come to life this spring. And I was lucky to come to one of the events for this, but without really going into a lot of details, I'm going to let Lori describe more. So welcome to the show, Lori. Can you maybe let the audience know a little bit about yourself, your background?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Lori Campbell. From granddaughter of a residential school survivor and from the 60 Scoop generation. And I'm First Nation with membership at Montreal Lake, Cree First Nation in northern Saskatchewan. I'm also Métis, so I'm Cree on one side and Métis on the other side. Essentially, I've been in and around Regina since 1990 when I came here to play university basketball. And so, back then, I was just trying to figure out who I was and trying to reconnect to my identity as an Indigenous person. And the university and the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College at the time, which is now First Nations University of Canada, really helped me with that, the people that were there. And so it's just kind of, come full circle in a really beautiful way that I'm able to come back for a position that I'm in that, never dreamed of back then, and they never existed. I'm the first one to hold this position here. So, so that's a little bit about who I am.
That's great. I do want to get to the series, but you said something there that I kind of want to dive a little deeper in right now.
Sure.
As you mentioned that, in the 90s, you were kind of trying to figure out who you were and your identity as an Indigenous person. That's something that, it's different for me. Like I'm a first generation Canadian with a Chilean background. So I kind of understand empathetically a bit about just that idea of not fully understanding where you're from. But one thing I've noticed talking to a lot of Indigenous people is, for one, I think that's a common theme amongst pretty much everyone, if not everyone. And that's something that's not common maybe for other people, I would say from like settler cultures, who definitely would have grown up in that same time, like the 90s or beyond. And just from your perspective, what was it like trying to figure out, what was your identity? I guess a very broad question to ask is, when did you notice that you needed to seek your identity, and what was it like going through that journey?
Yeah, and I mean, you make a good point. It's my story isn't unique. There's thousands of us across this country in similar situations. I knew I was adopted. I knew I was adopted, and I knew that I was Indigenous. And I think one of the things I try to tell people is that what is often misunderstood is people think that we were adopted and taken from our families, just because they couldn't take care of us or because they weren't interested in taking care of us. And when in actuality, that isn't really what happened. After the residential schools stopped, the government actually put in a new policy and decided to take kids and adopt them into non-Indigenous families. Most families were not aware of this and probably probably, in fact, all the families that adopted us. And I think that many of them were ill-prepared they didn't have knowledge of how to foster, connection to culture and who we were. And in fact, we're advised not to. And I think that made for a lot of challenging situations in families. And I often describe myself as, I say, I was, I was pretty angry and confused and lost and didn't understand, what had gone on and why. And I certainly didn't realize that there was like thousands of us across the country. And so when I came to university, I saw, the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, and as soon as I got there, like the professors and the older ones, they knew that we had all been taken, and that was like my first time realizing that there were so many of us, and that this was a government strategic sort of plan to do, and I wasn't the only one. And so, first off, I realized, that sense of loneliness or isolation kind of dissipated, and I felt a connection to others who were similar to me and had similar experiences. But then I also, as I started to, my first degree was in Indigenous Studies, and I started to learn that, essentially the addictions and poverty and challenges that Indigenous peoples face, like those aren't cultural traits. Those are like just symptoms of a people who are struggling. And I started to understand myself differently. And so I started this search for my birth family that would ultimately take me 25 years, start to finish, to find and locate all 6 of my living siblings who were spread out across a few other provinces as well. That's
wild to put it into one word that can't really encapsulate it. But like journeys like that, I just think, like I say, for people that don't have to think about that, I think it can be surprising that to think of that idea of that when you grow up, part of growing up, if you don't know who you are, it can make things just a lot more challenging to figure out where you think you should be going.
Absolutely, right? And I think one of the things that's unique for Indigenous peoples is that it was intentionally done. I understand there's other situations where adoption occurs, sometimes even cross-culturally or those sorts of things. But this was, very intentionally trying to erase. The intent was not for us to, reclaim our culture and thrive as Indigenous peoples. That wasn't the original plan. But, here we are. And now it's like, what are we going to do? And that kind of, is why we get to this lecture series.
Yeah, and actually that's a perfect segue into the lecture series. I think that does a lot of background work of the idea of, because we're talking about setting things right, which is kind of the English way of saying the series. And I guess to understand what we're setting right, I think that really did encapsulate a lot of, one honestly just really small part of some of the things that were wrong culturally within this country, specifically around how we as a whole treated Indigenous people and Indigenous culture. And as you mentioned, it's not even that it was viewed as lesser than, it was actually viewed as the incorrect way for so many years. We had another guest, she had mentioned that when you walked into the school, you could see like there was a big painting that showed kind of the way to heaven was essentially the Catholic, the Christian way, but and then the way to hell was anything to do with Indigenous cultures, and how like in the 90s, that's where things were still at, and we're just working at a point to try to really understand as a society as a whole that like, no, there's so much beauty in that, and that is a very, it's a worthy path, it's a great path, it's a beautiful path.
And I think that's part of like what made so many of us struggle is, even if you saw that and were trying to be that, ultimately you knew you weren't. Like you can't, once you're Indigenous, you can't not be Indigenous. If you're Black, you can't not be Black. And so I think for me and for many others, as we were trying to achieve and assimilate and be like, what was expected of us, it caused this sort of inner turmoil that really made it difficult and confusing. Like trying to hide a part of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So around the series itself, so Kwayaskastaswan, am I saying that correctly?
Kwayaskastaswan, yes.
Awesome. So setting things right. So I mentioned it was a discussion about how essentially engaging communities and how people can play a role in reconciliation. Can you tell us a little bit about what that series was, how it happened, where it happened?
Yeah, I think it was a really beautiful series. The South Saskatchewan Community Foundation approached us about this fund that they had, and they wanted to do some work in the community around reconciliation. And, in the university, of course, in my role, we do a lot of work around Indigenous engagement and education. And so it seemed like a really good fit. And so we talked about a few different options and what would have the best impact. And I'm a big fan of lecture series. I think, maybe because I work in post-secondary, I don't know, but I really enjoy lecture series opportunities. And so where we settled on was being able to do a series of 4 lectures in 4 communities outside of the university, outside of the city of Regina, where we could have conversations. And we titled it Kwayaskastassoan because I understand in our languages, many of our Indigenous languages, including Cree, we don't have an exact translation for the word reconciliation. And in some instances, I've heard lots of our people talk about that's not even really the right word because, fundamentally it means everything was really good and then you kind of had a fight and now you're reconciling. And there's lots of, within Indigenous communities, that don't recall a time when things were ever right. And so, and words are important, and language comes with a worldview and a different way of understanding things. And so my auntie, one of the words that she says is Kwayaskastassoan is probably a better word, which means to put things right. And so really that it positions us differently as we talk about it, right? If we're thinking about, well, how do we put things right? We're here now. We have done some learning and understand how we got here. How are we going to move forward? And what things are we going to put in place so that we can do better and put things right, and so that we can position our children and grandchildren in a better way than we ever were. And so another cool thing I think about the speaker series, and we got lots of amazing feedback from this. We did it in Yorkton, Moose Jaw, Swift Current, and Regina. We did do it in Regina, but we didn't do it at the university because we wanted to. Sometimes people don't want to come to the university, or they can be intimidated by it, or they feel like it's not a place for them. And so we really wanted to go out and reach everyday people in their communities. And most times we went to like the art libraries or a gallery or something. And so just like families came, like parents, like people who worked in the community, school teachers, and brought their kids, and people are interested. People understand differently now, and and they didn't, even a few years ago. And of course, the recovery of the grave sites alongside residential schools has been at the forefront, and I think that's really brought a different realization to many people in Canada. And so these conversations were just meant to have some dialogue, share some stories, try to build relationships and an understanding with people in community, and to show them that everybody has a role to play in reconciliation or in putting things right.
I attended the Regina one, so I'm very familiar with everything that kind of happened there, and I felt like the program was fantastic. I know it was Alicia Morrow of the Comeback Society, and then Chastity DeLorme had a panel alongside you. And there was just so much to learn there. And I'm just curious, did you notice any differences between speaking to each community? Is there anything that really stood out to you that maybe attendees were getting out of some of the communities?
Not a big difference between the communities, but I think just at the end of it, there were so many people at each location after, and in particular, I guess the rural ones that, really came up to us and were just like, thank you for coming. Like, people, I think, don't know where to start. And they want to do something. They want to be a part of the solution. They want to be a part of putting things right. They want to do better. And I think also people, I also heard too, because sometimes like their kids are learning things in school. And so they're also, learning things from their kids as well. And that's also making them curious and wanting to learn more. And so I feel like what happened at the end of those conversations where people were just felt like they'd learned things that they didn't. They also had a space to ask questions. We tried to really hard to create a safe space where people could ask us questions, because it's not always okay to just approach an Indigenous person and say, hey, I was wondering, right? You know, we can't do that. The people that I brought, Alicia and Chastity and myself, we work as educators in various ways. We were prepared to answer these questions, prepared with self-care after to take care of ourselves, because sometimes in sharing the stories, I mean, we're sharing our lived experiences. We're all granddaughters of residential school survivors. And so I think creating that openness and providing an opportunity for participants to just ask raw questions without feeling like we were going to say, oh, you said the wrong word, or oh, that's racist, or whatever, was really helpful. And that was some of the feedback that we got. And I think some of them, you know, were looking for to make other changes and to look at some of the resources that we had suggested and things like that. So, yeah.
I'm going to tell like a tiny little story and kind of just relate it to, I think, why discussions like this are so important. And like you say, having that really like open, safe space where you don't have to worry about saying the wrong thing, because everyone understands the intent of why we're here to learn. But I remember when I was in high school, there was a comedian and he does like puppets. And all of his puppets are like racial stereotypes. So he came to Saskatchewan, we went to his show. At the time I liked him. To be honest, in hindsight, it's not really like my type of comedy anymore. But there was a very, like for me, there was a very telling moment. He started to do an Indigenous person like imitation stereotype sort of thing, and the crowd went like so silent. It was like you could hear a pin drop. And I remember I turned to my girlfriend at the time and I was like, nobody's saying anything because this is our racism. Like this is what we live every day. This is what's embedded into our society. And the reason why that, like when you can get thousands of people that are laughing to just suddenly all be quiet, it shows that you hit something that people don't know how to deal with.
Yeah.
And I've witnessed that a lot. I used to be with Big Brothers Big Sisters as a mentor, and that's one of the things you can kind of witness there too, is that, you know, a lot of mentors, if you're mentoring an Indigenous child and you're not prepared, sometimes topics can come up that are uncomfortable. And if you're not prepared, the reality is like you don't want to say the wrong thing. You might just say nothing at all.
Right.
And the idea is, it's like we want people to be more comfortable and to figure out what the right thing is, and to know that, you know, you're not going to start saying the right thing or doing the right thing, but you're going to learn. If you're willing to learn, I think that that's important. And that's why this series is so important to me, is because it gives people that opportunity to learn, to take that first step, and to get a comfort to keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that in, you know, so many spaces and places where I speak is you know, I want people to have, you know, the language to, you know, the terminology, to be able to ask those questions, and to help them with that so that they do, you know, have conversations down the road. You know, I tell people, even if, you know, after coming to one of those presentations, you know, you may not have all the right words to say, like if you're in a group out with coffee and somebody says something that you know is wrong, or offensive or racist or just completely untrue, you know, even if you don't know exactly how to respond to it, it is important to say, you know what, I'm not okay with you saying that. Even if you just say that, it shows that you're not supporting it. And it's and that's the start. And that's where most people start. And so I want people to have the confidence to say that, and to be uncomfortable. And, you know, we talked a lot about being uncomfortable. It was uncomfortable for us, you know, to share some of these stories because they're difficult. But you know, but we need to be okay with being uncomfortable to have some of these conversations, because I think if we just stay comfortable, we're probably not going to have the outcome that we'd hoped. We need to have difficult conversations and find a way to understand and to move forward alongside each other. And so I really hope that was, you know, one of the things that most people left, you know, those conversations with, was feeling like they had some language that at their next, you know, gathering with friends or family that, somebody says something, they might have a little bit of a different response and understanding of why the response might be different. And and then hopefully we'll continue their learning. There's lots of great and fun things that we do, that show, Indigenous, brilliance and success. And, we just had National Indigenous Peoples Day, and there was, lots of things going on in town and in rural communities around and on TV and everywhere else. And there's powwows. There's some powwows that are like open to the public and people just to come watch. And a good MC, they're going to tell you all about what's happening. And if they single you out and tease you, it's because they like you and they're glad that you're there. And it's kind of our way. And so, all those things I think are really important, and people just should just like come out and get to know us. And
I think the one thing that really stood true is that it's okay to be uncomfortable. And I guess I mean it from a slightly different lens. Like, first I want to acknowledge, because one of the things that struck me with the series is talking or hearing Chastity and Alicia talk, is they did talk a lot about bringing up these subjects. It's difficult because you're bringing up past traumas, sometimes personal, sometimes just like as a part of your culture, your community. And that I guess I just want to say, like, we're really appreciative because we know how difficult that can be. I've seen it firsthand too with people in my family, and kind of in hindsight, I'm like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have asked them to do that. But from our end, I really appreciate that they're able to kind of do that and put themselves in situations that really, as you said, they aren't comfortable. My hope is that the more they do it, the less they have to, and the more non-Indigenous people and allies are stepping up and being uncomfortable so that they can become comfortable. And as you mentioned, like, attending an event is an easy way to start. Like, National Indigenous Peoples Day just recently happened, and that's a great way just to understand some of like the amazing beauty, humor, dancing, everything from the culture, and really just, like you say, have fun. Like, realize how great this can be. And then to go a step further, like, if you see a round dance, like, don't be afraid to attend and not know what you're going to do. Like, I can speak to a personal experience with that. My son goes to the Mamawea Titan Center, or he went there for daycare, and when he was 2, there was a round dance, and he literally just didn't want to leave the school. He went and sat down, so my wife called me and said, like, we're staying for this event. I was like, okay, let's show up. And we had no idea what we were doing, and we were a bit uncomfortable. But what we realized is, like, you sit beside someone, and if they know you don't know what to do, like, we got the guidance. We were made to feel comfortable. We were let known, like, if we did something that was against protocol, but in a way that was like, just so you know, next time, don't do that. And it really made it so, like, that one experience that we might not have had, it's like, then suddenly we're like, oh, that was great. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Let's invite people. But if you're not willing to just, like, kind of sit down and say, like, oh, I don't belong here, but let's figure out a way to make sure that we can kind of embrace this, then we can't get further unless we're all willing to get a little uncomfortable.
And I think, if I constantly think about, if we do this work and push it a little bit more, like, that next generation, they're going to be able to have different conversations and they're going to relate to each other differently. And I've seen it sometimes in the classroom in teaching first-year university students. I can tell where there's been a really amazing teacher or school that has really focused on Indigenous truths and contribution in multiple subject areas. And when I see those Indigenous and non-Indigenous students in class together, they're like in a different space than like you and I are. And so I just think, like, we need to think ahead, and knowing what we know now very publicly across this country. When our grandkids, come to us, do we want them to say, like, you knew about this, thank you for taking the next steps because now, things are better? Or do we want them to say, like, you knew about this and, like, why didn't you do anything? So sometimes when I think about whether or not I'm uncomfortable, it's not all about me. As much as I like to think it is, it's about, doing what we need to do.
Yeah. That's one thing, just as you mentioned, like, the younger generations now, especially, are getting more and more, I think, education and positive exposure around Indigenous culture that we never had, especially when I was a kid. Like, I'm 36, I went to high school in the early 2000s, and I attended like the first ever, it was called Native Studies at the time, the first ever Native Studies class that our school could offer, and the curriculum, it was like half a class. Like, there wasn't enough in it. And at the time I didn't think anything other than like our teacher did a really good job of like he was like, we need to fill gaps, I'm gonna find things that are meaningful, and I appreciated that. But what occurred to me after, like years after, I was like, why did that class have no curriculum? Like, there's so much to learn. And what we learned in hindsight, and I'm hoping it's getting better now, and I'm thinking it is, but it was a nice little step, but it still was a colonial view. So we didn't actually get a lot of Indigenous perspectives, even when we were acknowledging kind of the harms that were done. It was still the harms that were done, but kind of not from the right view, I think, to fully understand or empathize with it. So as you mentioned, it really is our role just to make sure that the next generation is set up for the success that maybe we didn't have when we were young.
Yeah, you know, I think about, I mean, I remember trying to learn the provinces and the capital cities. And trying to memorize it for my test when I was, I don't know, probably like grade 3 or 4 or something. And, you know, I think about like our education system, like why would not everybody also know the treaties, the agreements, the years they were made, you know, like the same way we know the provinces, and not just, you know, the year that women got the vote, but the year that First Nations people got the vote, or, you know, that First Nations people could actually hire lawyers and all of those sorts of things, I think are really key things, because without those pieces of information, it's hard to understand. You know, we think everything is equal within society, but if Indigenous peoples couldn't vote until, you know, 1960 or whatever across the country, then we know that a lot of decisions were made in policies and education and how everything was run without Indigenous input. And so now how do we ensure that is included in moving forward? And same with my work at the university. A lot of policies and procedures were made without us in mind, not specifically to exclude Indigenous peoples, more in an unconscious way, but now we know that maybe some of those policies and procedures actually do marginalize and exclude or make things more difficult for certain demographics. And so now we know different, so how do we put this right? How do we go back and make the changes that we need to put things right moving forward?
Absolutely. And I think that's a pretty good note to kind of wrap things up on. So I just want to really just send another kind of message of thanks and appreciation to you and the university for putting on this series and helping people get their first step towards how do we set this right and how do we move forward. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you, you know, it was great to have the funding, and it was a great opportunity, and I really hope that we're going to be able to continue to do it because community really seemed to get so much out of it. And so do we. It's nice to come out of the university once in a while.
Absolutely. All right, thanks, Lori.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for tuning in today. If you'd like to learn more about how you can make an impact in your own community, visit the South Sask Community Foundation online at sscf.ca or find us on our social media channels on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, or Twitter.
If you'd like to share your feedback on the program you just watched, contact us today.